All right. Well, thank you very, very much for joining us today. Yeah, I'd like to wish a very warm welcome to everyone to our meeting this evening, both to those in the room and those of us who are joining online. I hope you'll all forgive me if I begin on a somewhat personal note at the beginning of this meeting. Before our first meeting back on the 29th of June, I prepared a few remarks to say to introduce the panel. Sadly, just before that meeting was due to begin, my father passed away unexpectedly in hospital, and I was unable to attend. The reason that I want to bring that up is not so much to dwell on it, but to publicly say a big thank you to colleagues from across the chamber who were so kind and supportive in the immediate days and subsequent weeks. I'd like to say a particular thank you to Councillor Dan Holden, who had to step up so late in the day to chair the meeting. So thank you very much, Dan. While the words I prepared before are now mostly redundant, I hope you forgive me once more if I put up a new introduction, despite this being our second meeting. My dad was not a particularly political man, and truthfully, I was never quite sure who he voted for. I do fear he may have done some crazy things over the years, including perhaps voting for the Lib Dems. But one of my father's great loves was always the environment. I could always tell, even as a child, whether he was on a long walk or a cycle, that it was out in nature that he felt most at home. It's in part of this that I'm so honoured to have this opportunity, along with you all, to consider on this panel how Merton addresses some of the biggest environmental questions that affect the things my dad enjoyed so much, not least, of course, climate change. Merton Council has done a lot of excellent work on this already, but like any institution, there's always more that can be done. And I very much hope that our sessions can provide ideas and inspiration to further enhance the Council's work and make sure that we're doing everything we can to be one of the leading lights of climate action in London. That is, however, not the only remit of this panel, of course, and I'm excited that our work programme takes in a broad array of issues too, not least our relationships with housing associations like Clarion and Wandle, but also council service providers like Veolia and ID Verdi. In all these endeavours, I hope we can work together. Of course, there are a number of different viewpoints present in this room, but delivering services that work for our residents unites us all. And I hope our discussions can only elevate the work of this council. In aid of working together, I'd like to add 3 ground rules for these meetings that I will be keeping to across this year. The first is a basic one, courtesy. I don't think much more needs to be said on that one. The second is keeping questions and recommendations short and to the point. I know we are dealing at times with in-depth issues, but there are 11 members on this panel, each with their own perspectives. And I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to speak. I will always endeavour to have rounds of questioning, but with time constraints, that may not always be possible. And the third is that these meetings will very much aim to finish at a reasonable time. I appreciate this will mean on occasions that discussions need to be kept shorter than some may like, but there's little to be gained from grillings that carry on into the late hours. The officers who join us work incredibly hard, and I think it's important we respect their time as well as our own. Having said that, today's meeting, I'm sure, will test that third rule. Up first, we will have an update on the Council's climate work, which the Councillor Natasha Irons will be leading. This will then be followed by an update from Councillor Stephen Allen Brittis and his work on the transport brief. After a short break, we will then have 2 items presented by Paul McGarry on cycling and school streets. And finally, before we begin, I'd like to say a big thank you to Stella as well for stepping in to assist with this meeting whilst Rosie is unable to attend. So having said all that and going through all that preamble, I know we have an apologies of absence from Councillor John Braithwaite and Clara Dresselage. Yeah, that's very kindly agreed to step in, which is fantastic. Are there any other apologies? No, fantastic. And any declarations of pecuniary interest?
No.
No. Fantastic. And finally, on the minutes of the previous meeting, can I confirm that these are true, an accurate record of the previous meeting for those that were there?
Yes, agreed.
Yeah, agreed. Fantastic.
Chair, someone's got their hand.
Oh, sorry.
Chair, can you use one?
Oh, can you use your mic, please?
No, thank you. There was one panel wording in relation to collection of waste that we agreed in the last meeting. And I suggested a wording which was general in allowing for Councillor Irons and her side to develop proposals which are taking collection of waste closer to the community. I think the wording was pretty much along those lines, but the wording which is in the minutes actually gives a specific example. And I don't know if that was necessary or if that was actually agreed by the panel last time. So I did raise that. I don't know if that's been raised with you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Stephen. I think some of the confusion may be that the recommendation, a form of words, was suggested by Stephen, and then I was asked to summarise those words, and so I read out what I understood the recommendation to be, and then a vote was taken on that. And I think your query is the end of that sentence, which is i.e. community skips. Now, Rosie asked me about this, and my suggestion to Rosie was it would be possible to look at the video recording, because I can't honestly remember. But at worst, I think the IE is wrong, because IE implies definitely. I think it was an EG, and I think that distinction hadn't been understood. So my suggestion is twofold. Either we agree that it should be EG, because it was definitely for the cabinet to consider how they do this, or in fact that someone just goes away and watches the video and determines what I said.
Yeah, so I did actually speak to Rosie about this particular issue. She did raise that Stephen had been in touch about this, and I believe she is going to go back and check exactly what was said and amend as that is in the clip.
Thank you.
Otherwise, minutes from last meeting agreed. Fantastic. So then first up is the actions log. Are there any questions or updates or things that people would like to query of what was mentioned in the actions log? Anthony?
Thank you, Chair. Only to make the point that I think there are a few recommendations from this panel that are not on the action log, but I think that may be because they're waiting for sign off from the cabinet. So there are some around housing, and there's the one from the last meeting.
So yeah, thanks for raising it. Yeah, so I spoke to Rosie about this as well, and there has been just a delay with the election and then some break of those going to cabinet. So they will either be on the next next meeting, or if they've been rejected, then we'll have reasons why they're not on there. Right. So any other questions on the actions log? And then if not, if I could invite Natasha Irons to speak, who'll be discussing climate change and net zero progress in Merton. So if I can pass over to you, Natasha.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for having me at the panel. I took on the climate change role in May, so I still am getting to grips with a lot of the detail, but it's I think it's particularly in my portfolio, it's really important to look at what we've done, to not to get depressed about how much is still to be done. So I think it's really important to take a step back and look at how far the council's come, and just to acknowledge that. I just wanted to say thank you to Dominique and Amy and Tara, who have been amazing in bringing me up to speed, but also kind of not laughing at my silly questions, and being really open to ideas, and just having a great collaborative approach to how we do this, because ultimately it's going to take us all to do this. So I won't speak for very long. I hope everyone's had a chance to go through the report. But it provides an overview of our climate action in Merton towards the delivery of Merton's climate strategy and action plan and our net zero carbon commitments. In 2019, Merton declared a climate emergency and committed to working towards becoming a net zero carbon borough by 2050 and a net zero carbon council by 2030. By setting this more stringent target of 2030 for our own operations, the Council is looking to provide leadership in reducing carbon emissions and to ensure that Merton is playing its part in tackling climate change. However, only 2% of the borough's emissions are in direct control of the Council, so everyone needs to play a part in order to achieve our borough-wide target. Merton's Climate Strategy and Action Plan sets out the action that's needed to meet these targets and provides direction for the Council, individuals, businesses and organisations in the borough. Since the adoption of the climate strategy, the Council has published an annual climate delivery plan, which sets out the steps the Council is taking to reduce our emissions and to support and influence others into doing the same. The climate delivery plans for year 1 and 2 are both publicly available online and links were included in the report. So I hope everyone's going to have a chance to have read through them. The delivery plan for year 3, 2023, will be developed over the autumn and winter. As set out in Merton's Climate Action Strategy and Action Plan, to become net zero carbon, all major sources of greenhouse gases emissions must be tackled, and this includes the carbon footprint of goods and services, electricity and gas consumption in buildings, and petrol and diesel vehicles, of which cars are the greatest source of emissions. So making Merton a greener place by planting more trees can capture a small amount of emissions, currently around about 0.1% of total emissions, but strategically placed green infrastructure can help us deal with the impacts of changing climate, such as prolonged spells of hot weather and increased flooding. We're on track to plant 3,000 trees this year, and I'm really proud of that, but we can't plant our way out of this emergency. There are other actions that we must take, such as making buildings energy efficient and decarbonising heat, and that's arguably the greatest challenge we have as a council to become net zero carbon. But given that the council doesn't have its own social housing stock, we will rely on the wider borough to retrofit and decarbonise their buildings. So the council has been working with housing associations and partners across London to promote retrofit in Merton. And we are currently in the process of recruiting 2 community retrofit officers who will lead our borough-wide strategy on retrofit. To promote wider partnership working, the council also launched Merton's Climate Action Group, a partnership between the community and the council to foster the development of community-led climate action projects. The group secured NCL funding for 3 innovative projects, Merton Garden Streets being one, Energy Matters and The Will, which are being delivered this year. As well as helping to deliver climate awareness, these are also helping to create community cohesion. They're helping to reduce energy bills and are just highlighting some of the issues around climate change for our residents. So these are providing massive fringe benefits on top of our climate agenda. I encourage all councillors to get involved with any of these groups or to attend all of the events and to get involved as much as they can. So in 2021, Cabinet allocated £2 million towards climate change work in Merton, and this was primarily focused on increasing capacity within the council to drive delivery of Merton's climate commitments. And that includes the role of Amy Mallet, who's our climate engagement officer, and she joined the council in March, and she's working to develop a climate engagement strategy for underrepresented groups. Then the 2 community retrofit roles I mentioned earlier, and we're also recruiting for a role to decarbonise the council's estate, which is what we're in control of, so things around schools and the building that we're sitting in right now. So in June 2022, Cabinet allocated another £22 million towards climate change work, which we are working with officers to look at how we might allocate that. We're looking around things that we think there might be gaps in the plans around things like businesses and how we engage with them and encourage them to decarbonise. So we'll bring forward some of those plans as soon as we have them for you. So despite the challenging circumstances of 2020 and 2021 and in response to COVID, on the whole, progress has been good and we are working towards our targets. And this report provides a kind of overview of some of the key areas of progress, which we also covered in more detail in our climate delivery plan. So a lot of the kind of indicators and figures that aren't as well, I was going to say glamorous, but they're all in the delivery plan which is available online, and I would encourage everyone to get into the weeds of that detail. Happy to take any questions. Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Natasha. I'm going to take 3 questions at a time. So are there any questions in the room for Natasha? Another third? Okay, after you, Victoria.
Just on the priority actions in the plan, try and digest it all. I just wondered where we are against those now, because we're about 6 months in, I think. Are we to year 2? Is it February? Yeah. So it's how we're performing against those priorities. Any areas that you think are particularly of concern that might go into the red? Just be good to understand kind of how the progress is going through the year against those priorities.
Brilliant. Dan?
I wanted to ask about the Climate Action Group project, and there are some great initiatives in there. I wanted to ask how the council is going about promoting them and trying to increase participation and engagement with members of our community.
And Caroline.
Yes, I just wanted to ask about the garden streets. I mean, some of them look absolutely lovely. I see them when I'm cycling around. So what I wanted to know was, are there any schemes for people that live in flats and council estates to be able to participate in that a bit more as well?
Yeah, thank you very much. Just to introduce myself, I'm Dominique Hill and I'm the Climate Change Officer at the Council. Lovely to meet you all. So the first question was around priority actions in the plan. So we're talking about the climate delivery plan for this year. So I think the report, which was submitted for scrutiny, sets out some of the priority areas and some of the progress that's been made against each of them. I'm happy to run through those if that's helpful.
I guess more the ones that you're kind of more worried about, that perhaps haven't made as much progress, and that need sort of more attention for the next half of the year, really.
Yeah, definitely. So as Councillor Irons mentioned, Cabinet very kindly allocated another 2 million climate funding, which we're currently looking at what we want to spend on. And we've kind of done a bit of a review of what progress we've made so far. So we're still kind of going through the process of pulling all that detail together and getting kind of internal sign off on all of that. But I think, as Councillor Irons mentioned, one of the areas that we're conscious that more could definitely be happening is around engagement with businesses. So that's definitely a space that we want to try and add some additional capacity to drive forward, because businesses have a really important role to play in our achieving our 2050 borough-wide target. So that's probably one area that definitely needs a bit more attention. But in the report, there are the different priorities that were highlighted in the climate delivery plan for year 2 and some of the progress that's been achieved against each of them. I would probably add that recruitment has been a little challenging this year, I think just across the sector. So that's something that's been a little bit challenging, but I'm very pleased to say that we've gone out with our community retrofit officer roles. So applications for that close on Monday. So would really appreciate if anybody's willing to share that via your networks. That would be really helpful. And we're also in the process of recruiting for the climate emergency building surveyor role, as Councillor Irons said, which is all about decarbonising the council's own estate. So really hoping that we get some good candidates for that.
I'd kind of add that one of the key things I think that we're also quite focused on is engaging with people who aren't necessarily involved in the climate agenda. So I think we are in danger of people feeling like it's not for them and it's not up to them, but actually it's all of us. And there's so many ways into this, whether it be through the cost of living crisis or whether it just be through the fact that, it's actually quite nice to be on a bike. There are lots of ways we're trying to make this come alive for people who aren't necessarily thinking this is for them. And that kind of leads on to the question around the Climate Action Group. One of the ones that one of the schemes, Energy Matters, I just think is amazing. What I don't know if you've come across it, but what happens is the buildings and energy group within the climate action community group. They went into some primary schools and they delivered these sessions with children to teach them about energy efficiency, to teach them about why it's important, turning off lights, all that sort of thing. But then that was followed up with a cafe session with Crew Energy, where parents were then invited to get free energy saving light bulbs and that sort of thing, and they could also then get a follow-up in not inspection, that's the wrong word, but they could come and look at their home and make recommendations on how to improve the energy efficiency of their home. And these were in schools in the east of the borough where this is going to be most impactful. So we're hoping to have a climate conference in the autumn with schools, and I think this is the review of how this has gone is something we'll be discussing there. So I'm really excited about how this has come out of a community-led idea, but actually could have potentially big impact across the borough in terms of how we engage with people through schools. So I think, again, that thing of climate isn't really for me, but energy efficiency is. And if your kids pester you, that's for you. So I think it's a really lovely thing. In terms of Merton Garden Streets, I think you're absolutely right. Again, it goes back to that thing of, well, how can we expand that and make it relevant for everybody and not just people who have tree pits. I mean, I live on a road that's very hard to plant trees on, so I don't have any tree pits on my road. So how do we ensure that everyone's thinking about planting up their front gardens or putting in boxes on their balconies or on their windowsills? And I think we can do a lot more to communicate that it is for everybody. It's not just for people with tree pits and that kind of setup.
If I can maybe just jump in with a couple of other things that I just wanted to flag on the second question, I think it was around what we're doing to promote and increase participation in the climate action group. We set up a climate action newsletter I think it was a couple of years ago now, and that's got a really good sign up. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but we've got thousands of people signed up to that. So that's a useful route. I think as Councillor Ryan has said, one of the issues is that we tend to have the same people who are already engaged with the council's channels. So what we want to try and do is reach beyond those. So beyond the social media channels, beyond the newsletter, and trying to get more people signed up to that how we can. So anything that councillors can do to promote the climate action group would be really, really welcome. Also, we've been doing some events this year, and we're looking to do some more this autumn. So we had a kind of sustainability summer fair at Cannon's House in June, which is, I think, a good example of a way that we can engage more with residents who wouldn't traditionally engage with the council's comms channels. And we're looking to do some more events in September around World Car Free Day on the 22nd of September and the 23rd of September. So there's a few more kind of events coming up. And I think just through kind of people being involved in projects, particularly like Merton Garden Streets, which had over 90 streets sign up, that's a really good way to get that word of mouth effect where people wouldn't necessarily know what the council's doing, but they know what their neighbours doing. So we're trying to make the most of those networks as well that have been created through the Climate Action Group projects. But if anybody has any other suggestions on good ways that we could engage with people, please do get in touch with myself and the Climate Engagement Officer, Amy Mallet, who I think has joined remotely. Amy is currently in the process of developing a climate action engagement strategy, which is all about how we go about engaging with residents, businesses in the borough, but particularly those people who aren't already engaged. And there's going to be some consultation on that this autumn as well. So we'd welcome any feedback on that as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So 3 more questions, Jill, Stephen, and then Anthony.
Thank you very much. And I have 2 small things that I'd just like to mention. One is I'm particularly keen on engaging with businesses simply for, well, one of my major bugbears is the consistent handing out of plastic carrier bags willy-nilly without charge, which frankly I despair of because I didn't think it was allowed anymore. And the proliferation still of polystyrene and plastic straws and things like that. There needs to be some kind of an educational approach whereby councillors like myself can be armed with information and support to all these small businesses. And I'm very keen to lead on that if that's of any help to the team. Also, organisation of the disposal of rubbish by takeaways, pubs, people like that. I don't quite know at the moment, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, whether there is an insistence that they must recycle bottles, cans and things like that at pubs and venues. You can potentially alert me to that. So that's definitely something. But I would add also, given that we are fast approaching the disaster of the energy crisis, that should there be a possibility of the existence of these warm banks, which are being discussed nationwide, it is a learning and educational opportunity to reach out to residents that might be participating in using the warm banks to give them a little more help and advice. Thank you.
Thank you. Following up on a couple of thoughts as well, following up on what Caroline was talking about in terms of Merton Garden Street, I just wanted to raise the question whether we might be able to find some money for some planters for those streets which don't have gardens and aren't comfortable and already willing and looking to put plants in. So if we can find some planters somewhere, that might be able to lift some of the streets which are a bit deprived of greenery now. The second point I had was that the mayor supported a Solar Together programme to support the decarbonisation of homes, which I think you mentioned in your report. But is, as you were saying, Dominique, focused on residents and not on businesses. And I was wondering whether there might be any room either just as a borough or together with the South London Partnership, or feeding back into the mayor and saying, are there other areas in which we might have collaborative joint purchasing, particularly, for example, for businesses? I mean, what about charging points for businesses? Because lots and lots of businesses are going to have charging points. Or what about solar panels for businesses? Or just perhaps a collaborative approach to addressing some of this on the business side.
Thank you, Chair. I've got two quick questions. One about the council's policies. I know at one stage the council was looking at climate impact assessments for its policies in the same way that they're legally obliged to do qualities impact assessments. And I was wondering if that work was still ongoing or was still in the mix. And then on retrofitting, which I wanted to come back to, which I think is a hugely key point, and the cabinet member described it as the biggest challenge. And the biggest opportunity, I suspect, as well. And I wondered whether it would be possible for Dominique to say whether she feels we are where we wanted to be in terms of our action plan in relation to retrofitting when it was initiated, and indeed whether then there is a plan in place to get us to where we want to be if we are not, and some of the figures around that would be good.
Okay, so I'll kind of nod to the third question, but obviously let Dominique, because you asked her specifically, so I'll let her come in off. To Councillor Manley, I think on businesses and plastic bags, I think that's a really good point, and just the general engagement with businesses. I think it's low hanging fruit. That's not us spending lots of money. That's us communicating with people and trying to educate them. And as I said in the introduction, when we take a step back and we look at the gaps, the business, our relationship with businesses isn't where we want it to be in terms of engaging on this. I mean, there was some work done, I think, at the beginning of the action plan, but we then had COVID and that kind of businesses shut, so it was a bit hard to have that kind of engagement with them. But we are, out of that now, and I think it's definitely time to look at that. And we are. Hopefully we'll have some proposals to come forward with what we do in that area. And then in terms of the warm banks, I don't look, it's horrendous we even use the word warm banks, really, isn't it? You thought food banks were bad enough, but here we are. I think it's, I don't know, I don't know if we've got any plans to roll those out in Merton, but I do think it's a good point in terms of where there is provision for those who need it, that we're making sure they're getting the advice they need. So when we had our cost of living fairs recently in the libraries, Think Works was there to talk about energy efficiency and retrofit. We're also partnering with the Mayor of London on his Warm Homes scheme, which is where we're specifically targeting people on low incomes, and they were all getting given a direct mail, because again, going where they are rather than being on Twitter, we went and sent them a letter to say you are entitled to this and this. So we are doing all, I think I'm comfortable that we are trying our best in that area, but it's a massive challenge. On the planters, I think, you know, that's a fair point. Maybe that's something we can look at. I guess I suppose the thing is, if it can't fit a tree on there, it might not be able to fit a planter, which is the issue. But you know, where there are services and things, maybe looking at planters. But I think there is something around us actually just communicating that planting your own window box, it helps with biodiversity. Planting some lavender helps with biodiversity. And on the working with the South London Partnership, yes, that's exactly what we're looking to do in terms of engaging with businesses. And I don't know so much the detail around the bulk buying for businesses. I don't want to promise the earth, because we have only really just started looking at this, but definitely it's the space we want to be in. And then on the third question, yes, we're still working on the impact assessments, and that's one of our priorities to get that done. And on the retrofit, I think the figure is that we need to retrofit 3,000 properties from now until 2050 to hit our target. We're not there. We haven't done that. And the challenge we laid out earlier is that we don't own our own stock, so that makes it even harder. So what we have to do as a council is convene and work in partnership and bring people together and lead that charge. So I know that Dominique and the team have been working really hard to make sure that our housing associations who are active in the borough are aware of the funding that's available to them, and that are applying for those grants and are doing what they can. What we're looking at is we've put in a bid for the South London Partnership. This like a retrofit kind of hub for private owners, so that, because I think for anyone trying to retrofit the property, it feels quite confusing. It feels quite expensive. You don't know where to start. You don't know what to do. So we're hoping to have a bit of a web page or a hub where you can come and get the information that you need. So we're looking to invest in that and bring that into Merton, because we know we don't own a lot of stocks. We have to give people as much information as we can. We're trying to do some work around the mid-level funding. So if you're on a very low income, you can apply for some funding. If you're wealthy enough to be able to do this, you can retrofit your property. If you're a middle income household, it's very hard to know where to start. So we're looking at how we can kickstart that for those people who kind of fill between two stools. But then I'll let Dominique answer the question that she was directly asked.
Thank you very much. All really good questions. Thank you. So I'll start with the last one around borough retrofit, and maybe just kind of run through the things that are already happening and what more we want to happen. So obviously a really important step is actually increasing capacity within the council to lead on this programme of work. So recruiting those 2 community retrofit officers will be really important in increasing that capacity. Really hoping to get some good candidates for that. We've been doing a fair bit of work to promote, as Councillor Ryan said, retrofit funding for fuel poor homes with the GLA and their partners. I actually have a question for councillors as well that I'd like to put back to the group, and please feel free to get in touch with me. But if any councillors have any events or surgeries that you've got planned over the coming months where you're going to be engaging with residents and you would appreciate some support to talk about these schemes, that is possible. We can help arrange that. So the GLA could potentially attend, or their delivery partner Retrofit Works could attend. So please get in touch with me if you have any events like that you'd like support with. As Councillor Ryan said, we're working with housing providers to make sure that they take advantage of the retrofit funding that is available. So the second wave of the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund is due to launch in September, and that's basically funding to help social housing providers retrofit their housing stock. So we're working closely with them on that. Also promoting the Mayor's Solar Together London scheme, which Councillor Mercer referred to. Working with the South London Partnership on developing the retrofit roadmap that Councillor Irons referred to. Also working with our housing enforcement colleagues to enforce the minimum energy efficiency standards. So those are the kind of minimum EPC energy performance ratings that private landlords are required to meet. So through the housing enforcement's housing health and safety rating system, they're looking to enforce that standard as well. So it's kind of looking at all the different tools that we can use as a council, given that we don't have our own housing stock, to try and drive retrofit. We're also working with Merton's Climate Action Group to raise awareness about energy efficiency, but also to highlight some of the retrofit projects happening in the borough. So we're looking to develop some case studies around that. We're also trying to limit the future retrofit burden in Merton by setting ambitious climate change policies in our draft local plan. So that's something that's going through examination this year, and we've set some really ambitious climate change policies which go beyond national building regulations and beyond the London plan, and lots of other London boroughs are actually following our example on some of our policies. So that is obviously subject to sign off by the planning inspectors who are reviewing the local plan. But if they approve those, then that's a really good step in the right direction. We're also engaging with starting to engage with UK power networks to think about what the energy infrastructure implications might be from decarbonising heat and transport. So obviously, if we have to move away from gas boilers to efficient electric heat like air source heat pumps, we need to think about what the implications will be on the electricity infrastructure in the borough, particularly if you're doing that at the same time as decarbonising transport, where you need EV charging infrastructure as well. So we've started quite a lot in the space, but there's obviously a heck of a lot more that needs to happen. And I think getting those retrofit officers in will really help drive some of this work forward. So once they're in post, part of their role would be to develop a retrofit strategy for the borough. So how do we approach this massive challenge in a more kind of strategic way? Who do we need to engage with? There's lots of different target audiences, including housing associations, private landlords, tenants, owner-occupiers, people who can afford to do the works and people who can't afford to do the works. And as Councillor Ryan said, some people fall between the two. There's people who are eligible for funding, there's people who aren't, and there's people who can afford it and some who can't. They would also be developing an energy master plan for the borough. So that's thinking about the energy infrastructure upgrades that would be needed, and just generally increasing engagement with all these partners that we've talked about. So residents, businesses, housing associations, and so on. Yeah, so there's a lot more to do, but we've, I think, done a fair bit considering the kind of the limited capacity and the circumstances as well.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, are there any final burning questions that anyone has to ask? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned EV charging in the report. There was a big announcement earlier this year about, I can't remember how many hundreds you were planning to install, but not seen any progress since. So when can we expect to see that? And second question, I suppose, is most of what you've talked about seems to be spending money on plans and engagement and things like that. So at what point in the timeline will more of the spending be shifted to actually do things like infrastructure or planting or building or something physical rather than the engagement and the soft side at the moment?
The very last question from, I think, is it a quick one, Caroline? Okay, we'll do Slavic and Dan, but if you keep the questions as quick as possible. Well, you can have one as long as it's quick, Caroline.
Yeah, I was just going to say about the retrofitting. What happens if people, because there's an awful lot of people that are adding extensions to their houses, and some people are actually building a second kind of house in the back garden and stuff like that. So what sort of standards are they held to? And also there's a few blocks of flats where they're adding extra stories on. So what standards would they be held to?
Great, Slavic?
I will quickly expand on the EV charging points. You mentioned 300 plus. Are there any plans to feed the charging points to the community centers? We've got quite a few in the borough, and none of them actually got charging points at the moment.
Final one from Dan.
I know this is straying a bit beyond your briefing to the cabinet member for finance, but there is some overlap. And I was just wondering if you give us an update on climate bonds and where the council has gone with that.
Great, thank you very much. If you keep your answers relatively short, that'd be much appreciated.
Okay. Are you not going to be discussing EV charging points later? Is that not coming up? Okay. I'll pass over to Paul and in a moment then. But in terms of the money and I think it's really, I understand what you mean, because sometimes you just want to see stuff, but building this capacity in the council is vital. If we don't have the officers to do the work, we can't deliver retrofit, we can't decarbonize this building. And I think that the tangible stuff that you can see through things like the climate action group, I know that's not necessarily out of these particular pots, but that's the council investing in action on the ground. And I think we should never underestimate the work of those community groups and what they've done with that money. I think, Caroline, I think for the private extensions, I could be wrong, but there's not much we can do if it's you're a private owner of a property. You can do what you like, but I think when we it's a really good point in how we engage with residents and kind of try to incentivize them making smarter choices in terms of energy efficiency, and if you're doing an extension, what that should be to certain standards. And on the question of blocks of flats putting on extra stories, I think that will all come down to our local plan as and when we get sign off on it, and kind of hold people to those standards, because ultimately if you build it right in the first place, we won't have to retrofit it. So we want that in place by 2025. And then on the EV charging points at community centres, I think that's a really good point. And I don't know what the decision making is around where they go. So Paul hopefully can give us some update on that. And on the climate bonds, what we're doing at the moment is doing a bit of a scoping paper to see how it's worked in other boroughs and how it might work here. But it's kind of in terms of prioritization, what we've done first is try to build this capacity within the council, but also deliver the environmental impact assessments. And so once the scoping paper is done, we should be getting that back in like November. We'll kind of take the next steps from there.
Brilliant, thank you. Also, Dominic, please.
If I can maybe just jump in on a couple of points, just on the point about adding new floors to apartment blocks. If those are new dwellings, then the policies within the new local plan would apply as well. So there's slightly different targets for different types of development. So definitely encourage you to have a look at the draft local plan. Obviously, that's all subject to being signed off as part of the examination. And on the charging, the funding point, I think Councillor Ryan's already covered the fact that we need to initially build capacity a bit to develop some of these projects and to actually make the most of the funding that's available nationally and regionally as well. So we don't want to be spending council money on things that we could get funding from elsewhere to progress. There is some funding that has already been allocated for some of the big kind of decarbonisation projects that need to progress. So for example, there's been some capital funding that's been put aside for decarbonising the council's fleet. So there's a few areas where money has been allocated already. I think in the retrofit space, there's lots of national funding streams that are already there that we want to make the most of, but we're also using our carbon offset fund to top up some of the national funding streams where there's more that could be done on an individual property, and that kind of means that they can do a deeper retrofit and save more carbon in the long run. And maybe hand over to Paul for the EV stuff. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, it demonstrates the breadth of how climate change impacts so many areas when it suddenly dips into transport and community centres, actually. Where the council's at now with the EV charging, we've got over 250 electric vehicle charging points publicly available to residents. We bid for further funding. I think Councillor Hall, you were saying that there was funding a couple of months ago, but where are the chargers now? We've been going through the procurement process to get a supplier to deliver them. So that was Go Ultra Low Carbon funding in ORCs, which I can't remember the acronym, but that's the funding we got from government earlier this summer. We've been through the procurement exercise to find a supplier that is now concluded as of last week. The deadline for rolling those chargers out will be 31st of January 23. We'll be rolling out at least 250 lamp column chargers, probably more, and that's in addition to the 250 already there, which is made up of on-street and rapid chargers on the TfL network. Elsewhere, as part of climate work, but also in transport work, we are developing an EV charging strategy for the borough. The borough last year, I think, had, well, year before, 400 electric vehicles. That went up to 800 last year. So it's quite a growth in electric vehicles. We can see that through the DVLA data about where they're located with the registrations. And on our website, if residents are interested, you can look at EV charging on Merton's website, and you'll find ZapMap, which tells you where the chargers are if you need to access one. But more fundamentally, it lets residents tell us where the demand is for EV charging. So if it is community centres or someone's street or block of flats, let us know, because we are mapping already where the demand is for the next wave of chargers. With community centres, it's quite similar to council buildings and schools. We know that each occupier wants chargers. Some of that falls to the council facilities management, the council buildings, but we're working through that with the climate group as well, because they've got different power needs for different buildings. And again, things like the Civic has chargers, but Garth Road doesn't. We're looking at how we decarbonise the council fleet as well. So there's a lot of work underway, and I think the strategy, which has just been started, we'll obviously bring that back to this group for overview.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Just before we move on, is there any recommendations that anyone would like to put forward on this item? Any at all? No problem. Well, at this point, I would move on to Stephen and Britta's for his section, but I don't think he's with us just yet. So maybe, Paul, if I could pass to you to kick off on the cycling infrastructure, then Stephen can join us later when he's able to.
Thank you, Chair and panel. So the report here, I'm grateful to officers for compiling the report. It gives an overview as to where we're at as a borough for cycling. I suppose good and bad, really. We're quite open with some of that. Merton does have some good cycling infrastructure. Some definitely needs improved, and we know from listening to residents a demand for a lot more as well. In terms of policy, again, this links back to climate action plan as well, because we know cycling is a good way to get around the borough. There is demand, but we know there's parts of the network that aren't good or bits mismatched and not joined up. In terms of policy, our main area is we would implement the Mayor's transport strategy locally. And usually, I say usually because pre-pandemic, we would actually develop a business plan for 3 years. That would be supplemented with funding from the Mayor. And we would deliver a range of cycle infrastructure or training around the borough. That hasn't happened since the pandemic because of TfL's funding issues. So we have been, for the last 2 years, somewhat on the back foot in terms of developing a cycle network from Merton. That said, the pandemic did open an opportunity where suddenly everyone's living more locally. There was a demand for more local trips, and we all know that actually the majority of car journeys in Merton could be made by bike if the infrastructure was there and people wanted to. So there's this correlation between people who complain about traffic congestion, but actually cycling is part of the solution to that, and it all has to happen in a one road space. So the last couple of years, we've not had the TfL funding, so we've not been able to develop the strategy or any projects in great detail. However, we have delivered some pop-up cycle lanes through the COVID transport action plan that came to this group. We built segregated cycle lanes as part of the Mitcham Bridge rebuilds, and we took that right up London Road into Mitcham. Plough Lane, we funded that through Community Infrastructure Levy, where we're on site now, just editing the Plough Lane scheme, where that was previously a wide footpath, but we know through observations and how people use that actually we're putting segregated cycle lanes each side of the road there. So we are gradually, with our own funding, building up that network. With the TfL funding, we just had an update from TfL this week. They now have a much longer term settlement from government. We've now heard that the boroughs will get some funding back. We're yet to see what that looks like, but we expect that the cycling funding will be back in there as well which will be supplemented by our community infrastructure levy. So that's in terms of the routes. I know we get representation here from the Merton Residents Transport Group. So again, I've been part of that for a couple of years and really good work going on with the residents group for kind of a grassroots master plan for cycling and walking in the borough, which we will be looking to develop as well. So looking ahead slightly, with the TFL funding, we did commit last year, we bid for it, but never got the funding, but we're now funding it through climate change, as we do want to develop a walking and cycling action plan for the borough. So we mentioned an energy master plan for Merton. We kind of want a walking and cycling master plan for the borough as well. And there's a lot of that, again, coming through the local transport group. So we hope to develop that with the funding coming through in the next couple of months. Other things we've actually kept going as well, cycle parking. Last year we introduced cycle hangars because we know not everyone has room in their house to store a bike. We know there's parts of Merton which are quite urban. People don't have front gardens, so cycle hangars provide safe cycle storage on streets. We've rolled out 20 as a trial, and again online we've got residents now feeding back to us suggesting where they want them in future. So we're building up a list of where we can roll them out further. And the council's subsidising the cost of them at the moment. In terms of cycle training, again, that was something that used to be funded by TFL. We've kept that going because it's vitally important that we teach young people how to cycle safely, and that's right across all our primary schools. That is currently funded through the income we get from enforcement of school streets and low traffic neighbourhoods. So part of the fines come from parking back to Future Merton, and we are still delivering cycle training programs through that. So we're trying to capture where we can or ring fence benefits for active travel and cycling through other activities. Final one, then I'll pause to take questions. A new piece of work we're embarking on is cycle hire. For a number of years, people have asked us, why is the Santander bikes not here? It's just too far away from central London for that network to come out. But a lot of new companies have cropped up and they're on the radar. So we're getting requests from a number of companies to bring dockless bike hire to Merton. We've seen other boroughs do trials, some very successfully, some areas just get loads of bikes left in places, and there's a lot of management around how you manage the streets with that. We're currently in discussion with a number of operators. That will end up going through our procurement board because we will have to issue a contract to one or two companies to run that service for Merton residents, but we are actively embarking on that now. So we'll look to bring a bike hire scheme to Merton once we get through that procurement process. I'll pause there and happy to take any questions, Chair.
Great, thanks so much. And before we take questions, I wonder if I could pass over to Luke McCarthy, who's joined us from the Merton Residents Transport Group. So yeah, if I could pass over to you, Luke, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, panel. As Paul's alluded to, I'm from Merton Residents Transport Group and also representing the views of Merton Cycling Campaign, which does what the name suggests. I'm just going to talk briefly about 3 points. One about the sort of level of ambition around cycling in Merton, about the sort of funding as we see it as a sort of community group that advocates for cycling and walking, and then maybe just a few words about kind of where next. I think the first thing that I'd say, and this is kind of looking at sort of talking to other groups across London, is that there's a real opportunity or real need, I would suggest, for kind of Merton to raise a level of ambition around what's needed on cycling infrastructure particularly, and also to kind of take a leadership in putting the case for cycling. We've sort of heard about the multiple benefits of cycling around kind of climate change and air pollution, and as well as sort of mental and physical well-being. And it's kind of reassuring that the council, as it says in the report, places a high priority on increasing the rate of cycling. But I think it's fair to say that kind of recent actions and some of the rest of the content of the report doesn't necessarily live up to that sort of level of ambition. So I guess the map that's in the appendix of the report kind of looks pretty piecemeal, if I'm honest, and actually doesn't really provide a clear way to get from A to B, you know, across the borough. And the poor infrastructure is kind of acknowledged in, I think it's 2.16 in the paper. Kind of there's very little progress has been made on what could be some quite simple fixes. So around the reference to removing the barriers across lots of the cycle network that's referenced in 2.29, that's been the case since 2012, I think, and there's been very little action around that. And overall, I think the sort of our observation and so the tone of the paper feels quite apologetic around sort of cycling provision. It kind of takes space away from other users, but I think again it's about making the positive case that the kind of equation of 12 bike spaces to 1 car space, given what we know about sort of climate change and the cost of living and how much cheaper it is to own a bike, it feels like a no-brainer. But again, it feels like that's kind of that's done sort of made it in a kind of apologetic term rather than to put in kind of a positive case. Around funding, I definitely understand the challenges around the sort of short-term funding settlement from TfL, but I think that's not the only that can't be used as an excuse for not sort of having done more. I guess that's the case across a lot of London, but other boroughs we've seen do a lot more, either because they have been more successful than Merton in securing TfL funding. Maybe they put in their own allocation from developers or their own budgets, and what we've seen is that where boroughs have been successful, it's where they've had this sort of ambitious plan, the kind of master plan for what's needed, and then allows them to sort of quickly respond when funding opportunities come up. So I think the sort of lack of ambition and leadership and the sort of lack of funding, lack of success around funding, it sort of go hand in hand, I guess. And then I guess in terms of kind of moving forward, I think it's reassuring to hear that the sort of plans to align Merton's strategy, sort of Merton's approach to walking and cycling to the mayor's transport plans, but I think that sort of needs to have some quite clear sort of year-on-year targets. I think pushing everything out to the sort of targets around 2040 isn't helpful. It can need to have a conversation about like what it's going to look like in the interim. So maybe to think about sort of year-on-year targets or 3-year targets as to what that looks like, and particularly making sure that sort of addresses some of what's talked in the report about the sort of the recent decline in active travel. And then I guess my final point would be that this feels like that it needs to be a pretty big priority for the borough, and the sort of reference to sometime in 2023 for the plan feels a little bit loose, I guess. So I guess I'd encourage the panel to think about sort of what the timescales for that could be, and to be as ambitious as possible around that. So I guess it's mainly about sort of ambition leading to funding and then leading to the kind of practicalities. And I guess just to link this to sort of very topical stuff at the moment, the cost of owning a bike relative to owning a car is about 1/10. So cycling, as well as the other sort of well talked about things, it also kind of is part of the solution to the cost of living crisis. And for those that don't know, about 1/3 of Merton residents don't own or have access to a car in their household. So there's kind of broader sort of social equality implications for enabling more people to cycle as well. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Luke, and for coming this evening. I really appreciate that. I don't know, maybe Paul, if you may be able to maybe take on some of the points that Luke raised there in what you were saying. And also thank you, Stephen, also for joining us. I don't know if you have any reflections on anything that Luke added there as well, but if I could go to Paul first.
I think through the work I've been doing with Luke in the transport group, I recognise a lot of what's been said there. Where we are at the moment, I think ambition, the administration set their ambition out in terms of climate change, active travel as well. That still comes into our level where we are, the council has been funding it itself for 2 years through SIL. And also, as I mentioned earlier, with the climate change fund, we are beginning to work through with the climate change team how much of that funding comes the active travel way, because it is intrinsically linked to that. We recognise, the network is fragmented because it's been built up that way. There never was a cycling master plan, but we want one. And even 2014, we bid for the Mini Holland scheme, which Kingston got. That did set out a kind of master plan, but we never get that funding. That was £30 million. When you've got £30 million, you will build a good cycle network around your borough. But a lot of the ideas are there, and there's more coming through the pipeline with residents. What we need to do is engage, but get that, I think it said that 10-year plan, but what we're doing in the first 1, 2, 3, 5 years, because it's not about that kind of infrastructure can't happen in one big bang. It is piecemeal delivery, but piecemeal getting to a strategic point at the end is where we want to get to as a highways team. And with highways, I'm a head of highways, but an urban designer. I'm not a traffic engineer either. Giving up road space for more sustainable uses, we've been doing it for years anyway. So I wish that continues.
Thanks. Stephen, is anything you wanted to add on? Anything Luke mentioned?
Yeah, just before I do my bit, yeah, I've met with Luke and I recognise a lot of what he said. We want to be as ambitious as he would like us to be, and we'll do our level best. And I'll talk through some of the priorities that I've had. But Luke makes a very good case, and I've said to Luke and to the Merton Cycling Campaign that my door is open, that we'll meet whenever we need to, and we'll go through bit by bit what our efforts are, where the constraints are, but we'll certainly take on board their ideas and their enthusiasm. Passion is very important to me, and Luke is very, very passionate. There are other people who are passionate about other things, and they all queue up outside the door of a council or a government or a hospital, and we'll have a look at that passion and see what we can do for everyone. I was a trustee of London Sport, which is all about active travel, physical activity by people, and I'm very well bought into the need for active travel.
Thanks very much, Stephen. So just going back to Paul, what Paul was originally saying, are there any questions? Again, we'll take a round of three. Dan had one, Stephen, and Jill.
Okay, thank you, Chair. About 4 years ago, I was advocating for a dockless bike hire scheme in the borough, and it went to full council, and we was told it was not possible to do it at a level as we done at London councils on a pan-London level. Now what I'm hearing is the boroughs are back to doing things independently again. So what is the situation with such dockless hire schemes, and where do we fit in? What control and what remit do we have over them to make it work for the residents of the borough?
Thank you. With apologies, brain dump whilst reading report, I noted the following. The majority of roads in Merton are subject to 20-mile-an-hour speed limits, with some TfL roads also to become 20 miles an hour over the next 2 to 3 years. I've been cycling since I was 8. I'm relatively comfortable cycling. I suppose I should declare an interest in that. Until I was elected, I used to attend the Merton Residents Transport Group. Selfishly, lots of people are not driving at 20 miles an hour in these 20-mile-an-hour limit roads. And if I was cycling with my 8-year-old child along these roads where people are not doing 20 miles an hour, I would be very concerned for my child. So I think we need to think how we can keep people to 20 miles an hour where we are. We do have 20-mile-an-hour limits. And we also need to consider if there are options for getting the speed even below that for those people who are trying to get their children to learn how to cycle. I noted when I looked through it quickly, I didn't see anything about rental of e-scooters, even though we have lots of e-scooters around the country and schemes for local authorities doing e-scooters, and I was surprised not to see anything in there. And I made some other notes, but my computer's just closed on me, so that's probably enough.
Both great points. And give turn to Jill.
Thank you, Chair. Just as a by the by, there was a comment on one of these neighbourhood websites, which I try not to go too close to, but in particular, they were complaining about a profusion of Lime bikes seem to be dotted like aspiring mushrooms, these Lime bikes which you can hire or just get on and they get dumped and willy-nilly. So I don't know who Lime are, but they need to sort themselves out. I think people are getting fed up with them. That's a by the by. So an observation, as a disabled, slightly older person than most of the people in this room, during the pandemic, I dug out my tricycle, my adult tricycle, which is a marvelous bit of equipment, however, still nevertheless quite terrifying to ride on the streets, even during the pandemic, when there was very little driving. Perhaps there is an argument or a case for how do we equip and train and build confidence in the more elderly end of the population, i.e. people in their, maybe their sort of 50s and 60s who would want to ride, but frankly are too terrified. I'd get back on my bike if I could, but I'm terrified. So that's one thing. And the last thing, again, and just an observation, there is going to be a war of attrition on cars by dint of the fact that fossil fuel cars are going to go, and those who can afford to replace them with electric cars will be less than we imagine, which will thereby alleviate some of the parking problems, I surmise. Can we start forward thinking in allocating those extra spaces for bike hangers potentially? Thank you.
Sorry, Chair, very quickly, can I just say the 2 points I've got?
Okay, very quickly.
Very quickly. One of them is security of bikes is key. It's been talked about. I've been to Clarion premises and I've not seen a single provision for securing bikes. Loads of bikes they're desperately trying to attach them to downpipes and all sorts of stuff. So it's just not available for that. Perhaps the people who Luke was suggesting might need to have the advantage of cheaper form of transport, particularly. So if we can do anything there. And the other point I wondered was whether, particularly for adults, whether volunteers might be an option for one-to-one cycle training, since that's been raised as an issue.
Great, thank you very much. Paul.
Thank you. So the first question was on cycle hire. So a number of years ago, you're right, there was a pan-London trial. So it was led by London councils where boroughs could opt in to be part of the trial to see how the bike hire would work. Merton didn't feel it wanted to be one of the pilot boroughs on that. We were waiting to see how that pilot evolved before we chose to dive in. And many of the topics raised here happened. You had multiple companies operating in the same space, multiple bikes everywhere. Some companies then were quite successful, others were bust, and there's just mountains of bikes left everywhere. So whilst that industry's found its own level and sorted itself out, there's much more confidence in many cities now that bike hire is part of urban mobility and it's something we should go for. So I think that pan-London trial has come to an end, and I think the dotless bike hire is now available. So we're engaging with companies there to see who wants to come to Merton to give us some element of control. We don't want to just say everyone come in. We want to give one or two companies a contract to operate in Merton because they are all fundamentally running a business on our highway. And we want to make sure that the network is dense enough that it's useful to residents. So instead of residents having multiple companies to choose from, there's a couple there, so there's a consistent network right around the whole borough. So we have been watching with interest what's been going on elsewhere in London. Again, it's been much more popular in urban parts of London, but you're now seeing it further out as well. Sutton and Kingston doing the same thing now. So yeah, a couple of years ago it was discussed. We were watching, waiting, and seeing before now embarking on it. And the industry's matured a bit as well. E-scooters, sorry, e-bikes are part of that discussion we're having. E-scooters, I'm not sure about whether we are active on that at the moment or not. So I'm making back to you on the e-scooter point, if that's okay. With 20 mile an hour borough, yeah, absolutely right. 20 mile an hour streets do help cycling. Most of our residential streets are fairly quiet, but you know there'll always be one motorist who doesn't stick to the speed limit. There may be a few motorists that do that. Speeding is less for the council to monitor, but the police, because it's a criminal activity. Where the council can intervene is where we have to put traffic calming in. But there's always a point at which, you know, just speed humps, people will just speed between them and it's 20 mile an hour. There's a point where they don't really have much impact at that point. If there are any particular areas in your wards where you're concerned or you think this is an issue, please let us know, because we will investigate any road safety issues, and if there's anything that can be done with the highway, we will look at that. With adult cycle training, that is something we did have. We paused it during the pandemic, but I'm happy to go back to the team and see whether we bring that back. We had a course called Cycle Confident, and it was for adult cycle training. We've done it in New York Close Car Park at the weekends with stocker bikes at Civic, and I think also the trikes and cargo bikes as well, how people work with them. So certainly I'll take that away to the team and bring it back. That's a good suggestion. I think the final one, bike stores, is that what your point was?
Well, just, yeah, I went to the Clarion premises and there was no bikes.
Is that the new builds?
No, was the one nearest to here, actually.
Right. Question there is about the bike storage. So in any modern developments, and certainly a lot of the state regeneration from Clarion, there is bike stores built in to either the underground car parks or the individual blocks of flats. So that's a planning requirement now. But where there's existing estates, we'll certainly raise with Clarion, because again, the bike hangers, the easy solutions, there's often room in estates anyway to do that or within blocks. So I'll raise that with Clarion.
So, sorry. Paul, can I, in my communications with Clarion, can I point them in your direction then in terms of potential security? Thank you.
Great, thank you, Paul. Any other questions? Anthony, Clark and Caroline.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Paul, for that. I wanted to look at paragraph 2.29 of the report, which talks about the 2015 review of barriers to pedestrians, inconvenience for cyclists, as well as those for those with pushchairs and wheelchair users. And that talks about some improvements that could be made relatively quickly and cheaply. I just wondered why those changes hadn't come through, what the barriers to those changes were.
Thank you, Chair. The plan also talks about the implementation that is set to last from 2023 to 2040. And especially with the climate emergency in mind, we've heard people talk about it before. The document already talks about more quick and some mid and longer term proposals. Are you working on that plan now, even though it's been delayed for obvious reasons? And are you planning to phase them? In relation to this, you've also touched on the funding by TfL for infrastructure, roads, parking, and also providing lessons. How have you investigated ways to generate funds in a different way, if this wasn't an option?
Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I was just going to say, this is just an aside about the Clarion situation. Where I live, we've got 2 bike hangers. They've been there for 2 years, but whenever anyone's asked to use them, they've been told, oh, the keys are lost. And this has been dragging on for 2 years. And since I've become a councillor, I've been asking them over and over again and keep getting fobbed off. So that's the first thing. But I understand that they actually want to use the space to put bins there now, them great big Metro store bins. So obviously they're probably going to take the bike hangers away, which aren't used anyway. But the other thing I wanted to say is I wanted to know what's happening about Morden, because I actually went on a bike ride with Luke there, and yeah, it was enlightening, but parts of Morden are very dangerous. One side of St Helier Avenue, I did cycle there because Luke was with me, but I mean, I would never cycle there on my own. And Morden Town Centre, the cycle path actually finishes and then turns into the, you know, general shopping street, and then you've got the station there. So people are riding their bikes in and amongst all of those people. So I wondered if there were plans to do anything in Morden.
Yeah, Paul.
Thank you. I don't recall the barrier study. I know other people in my team well, but it's probably just before my time in highways. I do recall a lot of pedestrian guardrailing coming out. So Morden High Street was fenced off. We took all that guardrailing out. We took it out of College Road and Mitcham and parts of Wimbledon as well. And that was largely for decluttering as well. But we also found out that part of the psyche there is when pedestrians are barriered off from the roads, drivers don't really pay much attention. They think they don't need to. So actually for road safety reasons, a lot of the guardrailing came out. It did leave us with the footpath network. So there's lanes and footpaths around the borough where you'll find the chicane barriers at the entrance. And largely they're there to stop mopeds and motorcyclists driving down those lanes. I do recall with the previous cabinet member, I think it was Andrew Judge at the time, we did look at some of the ancient lanes in Mitcham, where we did take out some guardrailing and replace it with bollards. And what we found is residents then complained about mopeds driving up and down it all the time. So for me, I do get the point that the zigzag barriers are an inconvenience to cyclists. Cyclists will still get through them. They're probably more of an issue for cargo bikes, but they're vehicle size too. Pushchairs, wheelchairs and buggies should get through them. They're wide enough to get through them, so they're not an accessibility reason. But where we done the trial and we opened some in Mitcham, mopeds were flying through. Now that was 2015. 2022, streets are full of mopeds now for a very different reason. Delivery companies who will want the fastest, quickest route to any house with a takeaway. And so again, for the council and for me as a traffic team, we will review barriers where people ask us to review them. But for us, it's not about making it convenient for any one road user. It's balancing all those safety issues. So there may be some parts of the borough which are fairly quiet. The barriers could be replaced with bollards and it'd be fine. There could be other areas near town centres where actually that they're probably more needed now if the feed is there's more mopeds or anything using those paths. So again, in any of that, we can trial removals, see if that works, monitor the safety, make a decision at the end of a trial whether that stays or goes. So that door's always open. Again, I think the question was about the strategy in the long term. So yes, we have started the walking and cycling strategy. There's the roots of that in the borough's local plan. It's not a detailed master plan for cycling yet. We know roughly the routes to join up. We've not done any engineering about what needs built and what that may cost. And to some extent, the funding does follow. I think the ambition's there for the longer term. That's what a strategy should set out. What we deliver will be a mixture. It'll be small scale interventions, which we can pick up quite easily. There may have to be some big bang projects, which need to be phased in over a couple of years when funding permits. But that funding isn't just relying on TfL. There's always a cocktail of funding. It could be community infrastructure levy, it could be TfL, government funding often, or Merton's own capital. If we need to invest in infrastructure, the council can choose to invest through its capital programme. And we have done and are doing bids around that. But as ever with the council's capital programme, it's not all about what every one team wants. It's a balance between other departments and what the council does to do that. But it's always on the agenda. Just to see on the timing of that strategy, it's the same officers who are, I mentioned the TfL funding may come back. We only bid for that, so that's a couple of months bidding. That's the same officers writing the EV strategy. It's the same officers working on this. So I know 2023 was mentioned as not being highly ambitious. It's real because actually we've got a lot of work in the next 6 months. So what we're aiming for is next year we publish these plans and consult and engage on them. Morgan, yeah. Sorry, the cycle hangers, is that the council ones or are they Clarion ones? Yeah. If the councils, let me know because I can talk to the company about the keys, but if it's Clarion, yeah, I'll help you pick it up with them. On Morden, Morden Town Centre is not great for cycling, let's be honest. It is a dual carriageway built for cars and lorries. There's not a cycle lane on it at all, and that's been a frustration for us for many years, and councillors too, no doubt. As part of the Morden Regen, we have a vision. We've worked with TfL. Sorry, I should have said the roads is TfL's, it's not the council highway. So we get no power on that at all. But the mayor has launched a Healthy Streets vision. We work with Transport for London. We do have a draft vision for the highway in Morden, but it's down to TfL to deliver that. And that was exactly about shrinking the road down, having more space for cyclists and pedestrians, getting segregated cycle lanes through there, and a better bus infrastructure because the bus station is the worst part for air quality in the borough. So the vision's there and the solution's there pending funding. It was to be wrapped up with the regeneration. And again, with TfL's financial climate at the moment, they're not really embarking on any new projects at the moment. So all I would say is the vision's there to deal with that, but there's not a lot of action at the moment in terms of the town centre. We did have 2 years ago what was called the Cycle Quiet Way scheme. So rather than lots of on-road segregated cycle schemes, there's lots of parallel routes which are quite quiet. So from Collegewood to Morden, the quiet route's actually through the park and through the Wonder Valley, not on the main roads. But where that main road hits Morden at the roundabout, we still want cyclists to get through there. So there was a scheme to take the cycle lanes down at Abbotsbury Road, so parallel to the main roads in Morden. But that quiet way scheme, again, dried up with the pandemic and the funding there. So the plans are there, ready to go, but again, they're TfL led, not borough led.
Great, thank you very much. I know, Anthony, you had got a follow-up question. Was that correct?
It's actually a draft recommendation.
Well, we can come to those at the end, yeah. So any further questions to Paul from anyone? And if not, then what's your recommendation, please?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Paul for the answers to all those questions. We'd like to propose, and we're open to changes in wording, to recommend to Cabinet that they look at resourcing for and prioritise the walking and cycling master plan. And secondly, that they examine any potential quick wins already identified and still relevant. So the reasoning for that recommendation is, you know, the master plan. We've heard from Luke that the master plan is probably key to helping us nail down some of the funding. We've also heard from Paul, part of the reason this takes such a long time is that the same officers are doing the same plans, and so many different plans that are equally as important. We heard very similar from the climate change officers as well. And the secondary arm of that recommendation is about quick wins. And I think there are a number of things that we already know about the borough. Our officers already know about the borough. That can be done if they're still relevant. The report does in fact talk about things that could be done, you know, over the coming years, quickly and cheaply, and still could be done. And that was from 2015. Now, not all of that might be relevant anymore, but there will be some things, and that should hopefully, you know, give some ammunition to Stephen in Cabinet to push this forward, if there is support for it. But as I say, I think we're open to changes.
So was that one recommendation or two there? Two part. I mean, it may be easy to do, yeah, take them separately if that makes sense. But so can you just repeat the first one then, please?
Recommend to Cabinet that they look at resourcing for and prioritise a walking and cycling master plan.
Okay, great. And is there a seconder for that? And is there any people's versions on wording changes to that? Does anyone have any other thoughts on that? Okay, well, again, then we take that to a vote then. So all those in favour? Great. All those not voting? And all those against? Great, thank you. So that was passed. That was unanimous. And then the second recommendation there, if you could repeat that again, please.
Sure, of course. Recommend Cabinet that they examine any potential quick wins already identified and still relevant.
Good. Okay. Again, so a seconder. Thank you. And any further thoughts on rewording or anything like that? And if not, again, take it to a vote. So all those in favour? All those not voting? And all those against? Great. Well, that's, again, both recommendations are accepted. So thank you, Anthony. So I think that brings that section to a close now. So I think now that we've been going for about nearly an hour and a half, just gonna have a 10-minute break just for everyone, and then we'll come back and we'll go by Stephen. Thanks so much all. All right, everyone, I'm going to get started in a couple of moments. Oh. All right, everyone, we're ready to go now, so you can turn back to your seats. And just one quick administrative note, one thing I forgot to note at the beginning is that we're joined by Slavik tonight, who's subbing in for Martin Walton, who was unable to make this evening. So just want to make that, just to have that in the minutes. But now, if I could pass over to Stephen to give his cabinet member priorities. So yeah, after you. Thanks so much, Stephen.
Yeah, we take scrutiny very, very seriously. As you know, I was leader for 10 years, and that's when I made sure that scrutiny was held in high esteem, listened to, regarded, and allowed to do its work, and may it continue in that way. So you've asked me to set out the priorities that I'm looking at in tandem with our brilliant officers, and to make sure that we move ahead on transport issues. And one of the top priorities is safety and supporting the Mayor of London's Vision Zero. In 2021, we had one fatality, one person too many killed in this borough as a result of a traffic incident, 75 people seriously injured. And so for me, safety of everyone and the Vision Zero coming to Merton is hugely important. And I want to pay a tribute to former Ravensbury councillor Natasha Irons and current St Helier ward councillor Helena Dollymore. I joined them in working with TfL, with Seb Dance, the mayor, the deputy mayor for transport, reporting to our Mayor of London when we had that fatality of the Uber driver on St Helier Avenue at the junction with Middleton Road. And I'm pleased to say tonight, I think it's in the public domain, that we have persuaded TfL, and we're working with TfL to get that 40-mile-an-hour speed limit on St Helier Avenue down to 30. And that, for me, is what transport is about. It is about safety, and Vision Zero is at the heart of the Mayor's transport strategy, and I want it to be at the heart of Merton's transport strategy for our streets, so that there is no death or serious injury on our streets. So that pervades everything that I do as cabinet member for transport. With regard to another issue that is close to my heart and close, I know, to Anthony, to the Liberals, to the Conservatives, to everyone, and that's step-free access. I think that's hugely important. I was a Disability Rights Commissioner, as you all know, used to be Equality and Human Rights Commissioner, and equalities and access to goods and services is hugely important to me. I worked on the 1995 Disability Discrimination Act, parts 1, 2, and 3. Took many years to bring them in. Recall that William Hague introduced that piece of legislation, and it was the Labour government that did its utmost to implement it. And so step-free access to me is hugely important. So just to go through my priorities on step-free access are your priorities, everyone's priorities here. And that's Tooting Thameslink. It's on site. We've granted the license for the works to begin in late 2022, not far off. We're encouraging and in touch with Thameslink re Wimbledon Chase. I have personally spoken to the developers, not to support their planning application, as you all know, but spoken to them about that safeguarding, that place where that step-free access can take root. So if it is built, if they do get their planning application, that's quasi-judicial, nothing to do with me, then Thameslink will be honour bound to, and the place will be there for Thameslink to find the funding to put in place step-free access. So I have been in discussions with the developers there now to do with their planning application. We're also encouraging in touch with Thameslink Vice regarding St Helier and also with South Western Rail for Rains Park. And I know the Conservative Member of Parliament for Wimbledon, Stephen Hammond, has worked hard on that. I know Anthony Fairclough has worked hard on that. We've all worked hard on that one. And it is a rotten station in that regard. And it is to the shame of South West Rail that they haven't resolved it. It is a shame. Hayden's Thameslink, we're working on that. So on Hayden's Road, step-free access, I've got a note here provided by officers. Scheme has been secured via development site. It's not Department for Transport. It's not access for all funded scheme. However, the delivery of this scheme will require us to provide some funding for some minor enabling works and will be subject to an SCL bid this year. We've liaised with Thameslink to determine what funding is required. This is to fund additional CCTV, oyster readers and minor alterations to the southbound platform for access. Merton are putting forward a strategic seal bid to cover these costs for Thameslink to deliver the scheme. The bidding round is now open for decisions in autumn and funding available afterwards. So on Hayden's Road, we're doing our best as well. And the more pressure everyone applies, the better that will be. On some other issues of priorities, Paul McGarry has already spoken about e-bike hire. We're talking to these companies, a procurement strategy is in place, resource needs to be put in place, and the plan is being developed. So we end up with 1 or 2 bike hire companies we can work with. Obviously, that is very important. And Paul again has touched on one of my priorities, that's bike parking. And I want to thank Martin Welton, my predecessor, for the 20 to 21 parking hangars that we currently have. But certainly more are needed, and we appreciate that. Buses, working with the Mayor of London and with Seb Dance. The leader and I had a meeting with Seb Dance. I think we had 2 meetings. One, I think he came here, one we went there. And the electrification of the bus fleet in Merton is something that is top of my priority, and we're continuing to have those discussions with the Mayor of London. As you all know, there is a plan to arrive at electrification of all buses in London by 2037. Well, I'm sorry, I can't wait that long, and I'll see what I can do as the Cabinet Member for Transport here in Merton to have the full complement well before then by lobbying the Mayor of London. A rollout of EV charging again is another point, and here I want to pay a tribute to officers for the successful fund bid for £750,000 from the Office for Zero Emissions Vehicles, OZEV, I think is for short. I always remember OFSIC. Does everyone remember OFSIC? Anyway, Ofsted, when there was a huge debate about statutory sick pay. So £750,000, 250 lamp column charges to be put in place. We're also talking to the 8 service stations in the borough, Shell, Esso. They can do what they're going to do. They're huge organizations. They look after themselves. But it'd be nice if we were working together with them, because they will look to us for licenses, for planning regulations, for change of use, because people aren't going to be there for 5 minutes, fill up and go. They'll be there for 20 minutes to half an hour, cup of tea, coffee, sit down, bit of I don't know what's going to be there, but they will need our support in that regard. And so we need that. We as an authority won't have the resources or the space to create our own EV charging hub stations, and we would look to TfL, GLA land for that. So we're encouraging TfL and GLA just to see if they have land that one of these big service stations can use. And I think we've covered quite a bit about cycling. As I said, I've met with Luke. Again, that's a top priority for me. That's active travel. walking, cycling, using public transport. Very, very important. And I think yesterday there was the, and Paul may want to interject, there was a funding deal for TfL. It's still very short of what TfL is looking for. I think it's £600 million short. And there are worries there. It's still not enough. We will do all we can to see whether we can get the local implementation plan monies that we were due or were promised, 3.9 million lost, whether we can get that back. I'm not sure, but we'll do our level best. But it is about limited resources and the pleas and passion of organizations that come to our doorstep for support. I think that's it. I think you've had, and I'm working closely with Natasha. There are some issues about climate change, air quality strategy. I'm involved with as well, and so we'll continue working hard. And I'll do my level best as a cabinet member for transport to put that ahead, to seek, as we discussed, capital sums of money in discussions at cabinet level. But as a former leader, I'm fully aware of the pressures on the leader, on finance director, on officers. But I will do my best to be as ambitious and reflect that ambition that Luke spoke about. And I welcome the drafted recommendations that the leader of the opposition has. Do you like that? It's a new sound that the leader of the opposition has put in place today. So thank you, and happy to take questions. And as I've not been in the post long, I would welcome if Paul McGarry, who has an encyclopedic mind on these matters, can step in as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that, and no pressure, Paul, on that encyclopedic brain. Do you have any questions for Stephen? Anthony, any other questions? I have a question as well, and Caroline. So we will. So yeah, after you, Anthony.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Stephen, for that, particularly the detail you went through over areas of interest and concern like step 3. Do appreciate it. I have 3 very short questions, one of which is on step 3, specifically Hayden's Road. Thank you for the information about the SSIL bid this year. I wondered, and this may be a question for Paul, whether there is any work that needs to be done on the development, the sort of block of flats, because what you spoke about was the changes on the station. That's one question. My second question was the conversation thus far about dockless bikes has been or subscribed to the idea that they're not already here. Obviously they are here. I mean, if you walk around parts of Wimbledon, certainly my ward, line bikes are sometimes helpfully, sometimes unhelpfully placed. And I wondered to what extent we're engaging with Lime and also with human forest bikes, who I understand maybe even in discussion with already. And so it'd be interesting to have some information on that. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about, you talk about safety, and I think it's really important. I've had a number of residents over the years who are disappointed by the response from the council when they talk about speeding measures or measures to restrict speeding on their streets, and are told that only if there is significant injury will the council even think of it. And I wonder if there's any words of comfort we can give to such people about a slightly different approach, or does it have to be that only when an injury or death happens that speed measures can be put in? Thank you.
Well, I'll give. I know I didn't expect it before, not one, but we'll go. Caroline, if I go to you next.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Steve. Which buses are fully electronic at the moment, and what plans have you got to get TfL to speed up on other bus routes?
Thanks, and I think that's 6 questions there, so I might just leave that at that for now and let you answer those.
on my understanding is the bus number 413 are fully electronic, and I want to pay a tribute to a deceased former councillor, Mike Mannion, Cannon Hill, and the current still with us, thank God. That's Charlie Lucas, former councillor. They fought hard in Cannon Hill to bring in the 413 that goes down Cannon Hill Lane. So 413 and 200, ones that I'm working with TfL and with the Mayor of London on to see whether we can bring them forward is 163. Some of them are electronic, not fully, so that's an easy win, and I'll do what I can to get that to be fully electronic. And then we're looking at 93, 154, 164 and 264 by 2023 to be fully electronic. That's 93, 154, 164 and 264. And I'll do an email to the chair who can pass that over, because there's a few numbers there. Anthony, when I first became a councillor, I was pretty not reluctant, but always quizzical as to why the answer to a resident who wanted something done before something awful happened was that awful thing had to happen first. And I'll pass over to Paul, but my understanding is it's somewhere in there. It's in the regulations. It's part of the trigger for all local authorities as to whether they do something about speeding, about awkward areas, and the answer comes back, the bureaucratic answer, there hasn't been a fatality yet, and that is awful. And I don't know what we do about it, but that is something that all local authorities, all councillors grapple with, and all councillors are given the same answer by officers because it's in some conventional regulation. I'll pass over to see if Paul confirms that, and to talk about dockless bikes and blocks of flats.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, it is rather odd that the system is set up in such a way that you need the evidence of an accident before you can try and prevent an accident. Most of the inquiries we get, certainly around speeding, it's residents saying, can we get a speed camera? And that's one where it doesn't quite sit with the council, because it's the police who enforce speed. They've got criteria for speed cameras, and very much it's about what has happened in this road. Can that justify a speed camera going in? So speed cameras are good deterrents, but you know, we've got no power to put them in. Where the council does intervene, yes, if there's been accidents, we will always get the police report, whether that's an injury or anything more serious. And if the road design or layout is at fault, we will address that as a priority. So we always work with the police on that. Most accidents in the borough where they involve vehicles, it's often driver error or no other person involved other than a vehicle. But where the road design may be at fault or need an investment, we will certainly look at that with the police, and we always do with the police. The reason why we have to prioritise, or why residents may ask for some intervention that seems fairly sensible, but it goes in a long list of things we want to get through as a borough. We have to prioritise basically because we don't have the resources to do absolutely everything people want, and therefore we should start prioritising. The most dangerous junctions or roads will get done first before something that's probably equally sensible to do, but it's not it's not the highest priority. And for road safety, we prioritise routes to schools, areas outside schools, junctions, and then after that is your residential roads. So I agree, it does sound odd that we have to wait sometimes for evidence before intervening, but it's purely just to prioritise it, down to prioritisation and the funding available. I'll come to the block of flats and then e-bikes, because I forgot the e-bike question. Oh no, e-bikes actually I do remember. The two companies mentioned are very familiar to us. So what we're putting together is a spec for what we want in the borough, and then we'll have to put out for procurement to see if those companies or other companies are interested in working with Merton. So I can't say much more than that at the moment. I've seen line bikes around as well. I'm not sure why they're not, we've not authorised them to be there, but they are here. But are they? I'll raise that with them then. Because the whole point was we would license them, then we can control what's there. But I thought it would just appear randomly, but I'll follow that with line. With Hayden Road Station, so the northbound platform's already step-free. The southbound, there was a planning permission for a block of flats, and a step-free route was allowed with a way leave there, but it doesn't reach a platform because of the fence. And that was actually not down to the developer at all, down to Thameslink. As Stephen said there, they need Oyster card readers and CCTV, so we're looking to fund that. I don't think anything has to happen with the development itself. Throughout all these discussions, our transport planners spoken to the developer. They're not standing in the way of this. They got permission. They knew this was happening. I think what we'd want to do is, I think they'll get a little planting area in their car park, which would be the most direct route for people to walk. That may be a little editing of the public realm there. But I think more crucially, although the developer knew that they'd have to make step-free access provision, we may have to remind the residents in those blocks that that was part of the planning permission, and that the residents don't suddenly find a station entrance in their development one day. So I think there definitely has to be a consultation with those residents to say, or information to those residents to say that this is now happening, but it was always planned to be that way.
Thank you very much, Paul. Any other? I know Dan had a question. I had a question. Anyone else have a question? And Stephen.
Okay, thank you, Chair. One of the regular complaints that we receive is the use of heavy lorries going down residential streets, and basically these companies do it regularly and ignore us. So what can you do as cabinet member and as the sort of transport spokesperson to actually tackle these known companies and actually make them go down the correct roads?
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Stephen?
So,
sorry, Stephen. Can I just
go
it Stephen first?
Thank you, Chair. It was only to ask Stephen really if he had had a go on an e-scooter, and if he had a go, whether he enjoyed it, and if it was something that he would be thinking about including in the consideration with e-bikes.
Great, thank you. And just my question was two actually questions, kind of based on what something that Paul and Nancy were discussing already, on just what the situation is with Line Bike already being here, but we're also being in discussion at the same time. How, because I use Line Bikes quite a lot, and the way that the boundary works is kind of ad hoc through Collier's Wood, and then kind of scopes around it. So you can't get Mitcham, they don't have any, and then parts of Wimbledon, I think large parts of Wimbledon all included. So just how we're going out for procurement with this, but they're still operating here without that. I'm quite interested in how that's going on. And the second thing was just on when we might expect a deadline on the decision of, what we're doing with e-bikes and indeed potentially e-scooters.
So London Council, it's a funny name. It's the umbrella body for 32 London boroughs plus the City and London Authority Corporation. Yeah, it's London Councils. But I, as a cabinet member for transport, will meet residents. We met along with Paul, residents concerned about lorries on Grand Drive. Had a very useful half-hour to three-quarters of an hour meeting. And yes, I don't like it when a councillor or a leader says, oh, that's not us, that's X or Y, that's Thames Water, oh, that's TfL, or so I always say to residents and organisations that will take it up as well with the organisation that's responsible. You need to take it up as well, but we'll also follow up for you, and that's what I always do, whether it's Thames or TfL. I just think that answer to residency is an awful answer. It's not now to do with us. So there are issues. There are flagrant transgressions of timing, before 7, before 6, after 5, after 6, whatever the regulation is, wait and just driving down. Sometimes, when you see lorries, it can be a sign of economic activity, a sign of success. Got Rest and Waste, very successful company now, sponsoring AFC Wimbledon, but huge lorries, and it's a matter of talking to the proprietor, the owners, to see whether they have training sessions and reminders to their drivers. But yeah, London Council is responsible. No, I've not been on an e-scooter. I've been on a bike with my dad. I don't cycle. I need to, I'm aware of that. I don't mind looking at e-scooters if there's a demand, if there's we'll see what other local authorities are doing with regard to the hire of e-scooters. I wouldn't block anything and say, no, let's do this first. Yeah, I'd be happy to look at that, and I'll let Paul on any other matters.
Just on the HGV enforcement, we've also had discussions in Hillside Ward. I'm aware of issues there. So the rules we have is, yes, it's London Lorry Control Scheme. That's London Councils who do the enforcement there. We've got streets in the borough where we've limited access to vehicles of a certain size. However, it's not a complete ban. Lorries and HGVs are allowed in there if they're servicing those properties. So a lot of people are building house extensions, getting renovations done. They'll require skips, they'll require vans, deliveries, etc. So it's not a complete ban, it's for access only. The difficulty rests in knowing whether vehicles are there genuinely, and actually, unless the council's there all the time looking at every street, which we can't be, then it's quite difficult to enforce. So we do have enforcement officers. We can ticket vehicles we see there which shouldn't be there, but it relies on the council being there to see it in that moment, and we can't be everywhere all at once. We also met with London councils about whether we could use automatic number plate recognition cameras for enforcement of lorry bans, which in itself sounds simple because it's what we do with school streets. The issue is London councils will get legal power to issue fines to large vehicles that shouldn't be in the roads. We don't have that power as a council. But there are discussions at London councils about whether that gets devolved into boroughs for something us to manage, but currently we can't issue fines. And the discussion we had with London councils as well was if Merton put the cameras up, could our technology talk to their technology where they can issue the fines, but it's our cameras that are there. So again, I wouldn't say that's a live project at all. It's a discussion about, is that something we could collaborate on? And that's what it is at the moment. But it's a challenge because, you know, residents see their streets day in, day out. They know what's going on. We can't be there day in, day out as much as we want to be. But it's an ongoing challenge. And SatNav is what's making all this worse, because previously you drive through a neighborhood because you knew it. Now you don't need to know it. Now SatNav's sending you there.
Just my question on the deadlines for e-bikes, when we might know a decision when they might be on our roads, and I guess also just how they are, what the difference is between them being here now and on the procurement process going on at the same time.
I'll need to follow up separately on the Lime bikes being in the borough now and why they're there. In terms of timeline, I'll need to get back to you if that's okay, and the actions about what the programme is.
No problem at all. Thank you very much. Well, I think I need to cut the conversation there, just in the aid of time, because we still have one item left. But I just to say a huge thanks to Stephen for coming along, and also to Paul for stepping in on some of those questions as well. So if I could now, well, actually go back to Paul once again to talk about school streets and some of the lessons learned there. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, panel. I was going to say we've been to this panel before with school streets, but we haven't because you're all new councillors, so welcome. Just quickly, Dan, you'll remember. Just quickly to summarise then, school streets is where we realise we get a lot of complaints from parents, residents about the school run and just the collection of cars gathering in front of schools at the entry and exit times. We had been trialling, we'd done 2 or 3 school streets about 3 years ago just to see how that would work. We knew it was emerging in London. And then again, through the COVID transport strategy agreed by this panel, we managed to roll out a lot of school streets during the pandemic. We ended up being #1 in London. So huge thanks to the officers involved in that one. But it really showed the appetite for the problem, which because this happens in suburbia, people will drive their cars a lot to school, but the impact of it. So I'm not going to go through the ins and outs of what school streets are, but the lessons we've learned they're in the report as well, and I think they'd be useful for any other transport schemes we do in future. But just to quickly summarise some of them for me. The first thing initially was when the council does anything with traffic, our residents often expect that we'll consult them. and then make a decision, then we'll do it. And that's what never happens, because during COVID, partly because of the funding package, partly because of the emergency involved, the regs at the time where we'd do it by experimental order, and that's what we've done. So what experimental order is, we've got the power to do it, is we would put a scheme in, consult with people when the scheme is live, and they've got an opportunity to experience it in real life for 18 months. And then at the end of the experiment, they collate all that and decide whether you keep the scheme, amend it, or get rid of it. So I think first off, residents were quite surprised at the speed of all this happening. And a lot of people quite upfront were saying, hold on, I wasn't consulted. But the consultation was there all along and had been for 18 months after they'd asked that. So I think the first lesson was, yes, experimental orders they do have their uses, but our residents are very used to being consulted first. Local members as well often know our traffic schemes happening, so you can feel questions from your residents, and I think up front that didn't happen first. Not that it was a fault, that's the way they had to go in, but I think that got people off the back foot. And for us as officers as well, quite often we can explain a scheme, the benefits and the rationale for it, but rolling out 28 in one go and just doing it and then consulting after meant that we could spend the time engaging people either, or doing as much as we want to do to support and promote the scheme. So I think experimental orders have their use, but it's not what our residents are used to. I would probably say as well, if we hadn't done experimental orders and just asked people, would you want a school street, and then done it, we maybe never have got that many. So swings and roundabouts there. The benefit of it being an experiment is the schemes did evolve as they went on. So they were there for 18 months trial. Working with a lot of residents and a lot of the feedback, it was invaluable because not a lot of London councils had done this, and the exemption policy really did evolve right through the whole 18 months. So when we started school streets, residents felt like, hold on, am I not allowed to drive down my street? We're like, no, you can get a permit, residents are allowed. We're not trying to catch residents out. We're trying to stop all the traffic for schools. So we evolved the exemption policy throughout the whole process. It's quite generous. It covers a lot of scenarios that we probably wouldn't have thought of initially, but now we know about them. So that's working well now, where most people can phone up the council or use Ring, go and get the exemptions for them, visitors, carers. You know, if someone's got a hospital appointment, neighbours coming, the technology is now there to deal with that, which we would never have known at the beginning. Two final points really. One was timing. When we started this, it was during lockdown. A lot of primary schools had staggered entry times. So some years are going in at certain times in 15, 20-minute bands. So the school streets started with quite a long hours of operation in the morning and afternoon. And again, a lot of people felt that that was a bit too much, but unless you've got kids in a school, you would know what the school times were, or that they were staggered during COVID. So it looked quite draconian quite early on. In the middle of the experimental period, we then began to shrink those hours of operation, because the schools were returning back to normal times, and that's where we're pretty much are there now. So it's roughly, we've shrunk by about 15 minutes each side of the school day. So at the end of the experiment, we've now, I think last April, we've reflected on all the feedback, we've made some amendments, and we've now made them all permanent, and they're up and running. Two comments I get around the enforcement of it. So when we started the school streets, we did enforce with automatic number plate recognition cameras. That was funded by Merton Community Infrastructure Levy. We didn't have enough funding or enough cameras to cover every school street. So what we set up is we would put cameras in, but rotate them around different places, different turn times. Because also what we found is compliance will kick in. A lot of people will get fines up front, but then they then learn not to be in the school street and compliance drops off. So actually circulating the cameras was actually quite a clever move in terms of costs to the authority, but still allowing us to enforce where needed. And there's also that element of surprise about what street is getting enforced this week. So I think that worked quite well with us. Another feedback we had, again, we've edited some of the signs. Some people felt the signs were too detailed, too much information on them. Others felt there was not enough, and they wanted term times added to them. Now, every school is slightly different term times, and the term times change every year by date. So we are not going to run around the borough constantly changing signs, but we have added term time only to the signs there. So I think it's been a long process for us, a learning curve for all members involved and the community involved, but by and large, Some of the schools have been really positive with it, with the head teachers as well. They're really seeing the benefit of just having less cars outside the schools. I would say a negative that still goes on now is there is slight displacement with some schools where parents are still driving. Perhaps they have to. I mean, it's not about getting rid of every vehicle, but they're going to the edge of the school zone and still dropping off, and that's causing parking problems just on the fringes. But I would say maybe a handful of schools that's happening, not everywhere. So we are still working with parking colleagues to get enforcement in those areas if we need to. Overall, I think it's been a positive experience that's helped air quality and road safety directly outside schools where it matters. But I'll pause there and take questions.
Great, thanks so much, Paul. Do we have any questions? One from Dan. Any other questions? Stephen, and Anthony. Great.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Quite a few of these school streets were controversial, and some of them raised a heck of a lot of fines and PCNs issued. Has the rate of those PCN issues dropped off, and if not, why not? And would that be a sign that the sign of them is not very good? So there's one in particular, Hollymount School, was particularly notorious in Mains Park. Has that calmed down yet?
Stephen.
Thank you. Reading the report, sorry, I think I should say first, I think that the council and the officers did a wonderful job implementing these things and having the balls to maintain it, given the flack that they suffered through the process. I think there's lots of benefit had for children, and it's certainly been interesting and informative to people to have had them in place. And I think the fine tuning of it has made it a lot more tolerable for everybody. So I think, the council is to be applauded in general. I think one of the points that was made was about the visibility of the school streets, and that being a challenge. As a driver as well as a cyclist, I know if you're not familiar with a road that you don't necessarily see signs. One of the suggestions that I heard was whether those streets could be made a little bit more obviously different. Obviously I'm an enthusiast for planters for reasons that I raised earlier on, and some greenery and so on, but I think planters have been raised as a possibility for differentiating streets, that perhaps that might be a way of making it obvious if you've got a school street, so you're not so likely to get a PCN because you haven't gone down there by accident.
Thanks, Stephen. And then Anthony.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to ask about the crossover with the climate action plan. School streets are a KPI in the action plan, but what we've never seen is the sort of evidential kind of thought process behind school streets. And I also think this has got some tie-ins with the consultation point you make, which I think is quite a good one, is actually if you ask people up front, before there's any evidence at all, you get one answer. And if you ask people after you've shown them the evidence, you get a slightly different answer. And I wondered what, is there an evidence base that the council is using in the climate action plan that justifies these? And if not, is it just the assumption that there will be fewer cars outside the school and that's a good thing, which is undoubtedly true, but is that how it works, or is there a more detailed kind of plan in place? Because they are in the action plan, so therefore I assume there might be like a carbon calculation or a number of vehicles calculation.
Over to you, Paul.
Thank you. In terms of the fines and PCNs that have been generated by the school street enforcement, I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but I know that is available from Parking Services. I've seen it a couple of months ago, so we could bring an update to that if the panel wants that in future. The general trend is, and sorry, I should have said as well, initially when we started this, we didn't give people fines initially. We gave people a warning and a reminder that this was happening, and then we started fining. So again, if we made that clear to people and gave a bit longer with a warning, maybe we would have settled in better with residents then. The fines and PCNs, generally, we found that they do begin to tail off. It took a while for that to happen, but it does. Compliance kicks in, people get used to the scheme, they're aware of it. After a couple of fines, you learn your lesson. Oddly, there's a couple of parts of the borough where that just isn't happening and the fines are consistently high. We don't know why. Either people will just pay the money and drive there because that's so convenient for them and money's no object. I don't know. We can't explain why people do it, but you would think after weeks of fines, you would decide not to drive down that road, but people still are. So we don't understand why, but there are certain locations where that is obviously still happening. And it's inexplainable. Or maybe there's no money in sense in some places, who knows? So yeah, if you want the details, we can provide that in future from Parking Services. The climate link, I suppose is evidence-based or assumption? It's probably somewhere in between. As part of the bid into TfL, we did have to put some monitoring and evaluation in there. It wasn't to the level of counting carbon emissions outside the school before and after, or number of vehicles before and after, because intuitively, if the vehicles aren't there, as you suggested, Anthony, is you know what to say, if the vehicles are not there, they're not polluting. And people are adjusting their journeys and walking to school, even where people are displacing slightly. They might be parking further away, but still walking 5 minutes to the school. That's still active travel. So for us, that's still a win. Not as great as walking completely to school, but still a win. So I think, again, given the scale and speed at which we done school streets, I think if I was doing it again, I probably would spend a bit more time up front thinking about how we monitor and value this, but we went straight in and done it. But I think the link back to climate change is interesting because, yeah, yes, promoting active travel is great. Try to count the carbon emissions saved from that is a very interesting point. So I don't think we are set up to do that, but we can follow that up. And I'm missing the point. Oh yeah, looking differently. We are also thinking where, again, where the fines are high. We've looked at other boroughs and they've done more decorative features with the lampposts. It's not just traffic signs. They've got the coloured banners. School kids have designed them saying School Street. So we could they're quite cheap and easy to do actually. So we could do that. Decorate the streets if we need to. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Paul. Yeah, maybe that could be a possible recommendation, and we'll come to that at the end. So only just one more round because I know I'm conscious of time, and not so. If we can keep questions very brief, that would be great. So I've got a question. I can see James has one, and then last question I'll go with Jill. James, do you want to start off, please?
Yeah, I mean, I'd ask Paul in the local school near me to do with street signs. You know, I managed to get a camera reinstalled, you know, and promised that it would stay there for a year. And things have got better with people parking, you know, on the schools, on the lines and that. I know you can't, you've only got so many enforcement officers and things, but I mean, don't laugh, but I mean, it's like a drone, not an answer for hotspots. You know, is that not a possibility, you know, for looking at the cars and things? Or is that just silly?
Thanks, James. Jill?
Couple of observations, if I may. I live on Cricket Green and I have 3 primary schools in very close proximity, one of which at the moment is the only one that has a school street, which is Date Valley School. I'm sure you're familiar with the territory. 2 issues here. Number one, we have a health clinic there, the polyclinic, whose visitors are regularly getting clobbered because they don't necessarily know there is a restriction and there's no display of term times, which I will come to. What that has highlighted to me and the residents is that the restriction doesn't start early enough because the parents are coming in 5 minutes before the restriction, nipping up the path, parking, waiting for school to open, and the kids are dropped off. So I would become stricter and extend it, make the start times earlier, both for the morning and the afternoon session, rather than a later finish, if I may make that suggestion. What it also has done is highlight very strongly to me the need for further school streets. In particular, I went for a lovely site visit with the cabinet member recently, and pointed out the Catholic school, primary school next door to me, on Cricket Green, where we have a fine example of the nightmare that the parents are causing in terms of parking, and we had big discussion about that. So I think let's bring these in where there are really dangerous situations. Let's push for it. And finally, I have a solution for you. You probably heard of these signs that estate agents have put up regularly, which are made of a fabric called Corex. It's a very cheap thing to reproduce. May I suggest that on an annual basis, each school has a Corex board with its term dates printed on it very clearly under its sign, which only needs replacing once a year and would be cost effective on that basis. Failing that, could the schools be made responsible for putting notes through the local residence door of their annual term dates with half-term dates, which would be even more cost effective? Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jill. And just one final question from me. I'd like to echo some of Stephen's words about what I think it's a fantastic achievement the council's done with its 42% of schools and really putting itself at the forefront of London councils. My question would be, obviously that's still leaves 58% left, and whether it would be possible to look at producing a plan. I know some of those are just, a non-starters from the beginning because of that particular location, but there is a possibility of looking at how we can potentially expand that to every school in Merton, or if not, why not?
Thank you. In terms of the cameras, so the reason cameras are appearing then disappearing is because we do rotate them round the different school streets for the enforcement. The drone suggestion, I don't think is silly at all. Actually, it probably is going to be the future. But the reason we're using ANPR cameras at the moment, ANPR is automatic number plate recognition. There's very specific types of cameras that are only licensed for these types of activities where we can issue a fine legally. So me walking around my iPhone taking photos of cars, I can't issue a fine. The council having a properly spec'd camera can do that. So there's a limit at the moment as to how we do it, but I'm sure drones will feature in future, no doubt. The cricket green one, I'm very aware with the issues there as well, and I get it from both sides, from the communities support the school streets, the people going to the clinic. We've not had many complaints from visitors to the clinic. It does tend to be the staff, and we're saying, well, where's this staff travel plan? NHS, and we know that facility is tied with the Wilson, which may not be there for a long time anyway because they're being combined. So definitely I'll take that offline in terms of the hours of operation and anything to be edited there, because I'm aware of that. And sorry, so going forward on other school streets, really encouraged to hear there's other schools that may be candidates that local members are supporting. That's great. I know that a few head teachers are contacting me asking can they be a school street as well. And so for us really it is down to the resource, and all I would say is in the last year we've been through the period of reviewing all the first batch, working with TfL on them. Now that TfL funding is coming back and now that administration's in and settled with the new priorities, I think there's a discussion now about what's the next ambition. I don't think that was a one-off. Certainly as a highway manager I would support more, but that needs a broader discussion and agreement at council. But the door's open there now, and I think they are gaining momentum. So I don't see a reason why we wouldn't carry on with them, but as and when people want them, I guess.
Yeah, just wanted to come in on a couple of items. So yeah, the point by Councillor James Willis-Croft about drones is not silly. It is the future, but and so we need to wait for that to pass, to take place in terms of prescribed tools. And as you all know, local authorities are the most prescribed organizations in the country. And as Paul has stated, we can't use any willy-nilly camera. It has to be an approved spec, and all local authorities have to use spec cameras for ANPR, and so that the ticket follows. I'll take on board the well done on 42%. Good point. There's 58%. I'm a huge respecter of head teachers. I think they do, well, all teachers, but head teachers in particular, do a marvelous job. I think we need to have a conversation with all of them, but I think a head teacher that puts their hand up to want this has heard how successful it is and how beneficial it is to the children from other head teachers. So we can raise this at the secondary head teachers forum, the primary head teachers forum. I'm a great believer in going with head teachers and not against head teachers. They're pivotal people in our borough. What we don't want to do is to force things on organisations like schools. And as Paul said, this was kind of forced without consultation. And let's not forget, sometimes shops forget the most important person is the customer. Teachers forget the most important person is the school child. Let's not forget the most important people here are the children, the school children, and their ability to walk rather than be driven, and better air quality for them, and that's crucial. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Stephen. So just on that, I just bring us then to any recommendations for this item. So are there any recommendations on this item? I think I'd like to maybe look at one that along the side that Stephen mentioned around decorative features for these roads. So something along the lines of the council exploring the possibility for planters and I don't know how you'd word the rest of it, and particular features that make it clear that it's a school street. Jill.
I would also like to make a recommendation that we implement a method of displaying turn time dates on a very
one recommendation at a time, and then we'll
yes,
cover this
okay,
one.
thank you.
Yeah. So whatever my garbled recommendation was there around exploring the possibility of planters and other decorative features to clearly mark school streets out. Does anyone want to second that? Dan would second that. Great. And any thoughts on the wording for that? And if not, we'll go straight to a vote. So it's all those in favour? All those not voting? And all those against? I guess that's passed unanimously. And now, Jill, I know you mentioned you had a...
Yes, my bugbear. I recommend that we find a cost-effective, efficient way of displaying term time dates on an annual basis affixed to the school street sign post, with the backup of materials put through resident stores in the form of a letter. But it is vital. Thank you.
I think that sounds like two separate points around.
Probably right. Let's just go for the boards.
Okay. Okay. Any thoughts there on the wording or anything like that? Yeah, Anthony.
I think probably support the principle of it, but I wonder if it's maybe slightly too prescriptive. The panel has previously considered a recommendation, which was that Cabinet consider the information provided on the operation of the zones, which just gives Cabinet more room to consider how they do it. It sort of sets up the principle. I think we're probably going a step too far if we're saying these boards have to appear in this place, or even worse, schools have to deliver leaflets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a fair point. Jill, you happy with that?
I'm satisfied with that. I merely will keep mentioning that as a cost-effective potential measure. However, I am to be persuaded otherwise. It's fine as long as the recommendation goes through.
Well, I mean, if you're happy with the wording of that, then is there a seconder for that? So, I mean, I think, Anthony, could you repeat what you suggested there?
Yes, so the panel previously considered a larger recommendation. The smaller bit of it was that Cabinet review the information provided on the operation of the zones. And I'm happy to second that.
But it needs to be more specific than that. That you're not being specific. What we're trying to pin down here is the advertising of term and half-term dates for the school year. This isn't being specific.
I think it's inclusive, but I don't mind if you want to add further
I think we need to be specific, otherwise it's far too nebulous if you don't.
I'm just reading it now. It says Cabinet review information on operation of zones. I mean, it could Cabinet review information on the term times. Yeah, including term times. Yeah. Great. Okay, so So what we've got there, so cabinet review information and operation of zones and term signs in school streets. Does that sound
Chair.
good? Yeah.
Are we not talking about the communication of term times rather than merely the operation of the schemes?
I think it's kind of the talking about, I guess, the signage that is around these school streets.
Hence my use of the word communication. I would suggest perhaps if you stick the word communication in terms of operation, communication, because it's rather like you were suggesting in terms of signage. It's about communicating with our residents so that they know what's happening.
Okay, yeah. So cabinet review, the communication of zones, including term times and school streets. Something. Does that do the job? Yeah. Joe, you happy with that? Cool. Okay. So. Okay. 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 Great. So Anthony, are you still happy to second that? Okay. Great. Cool. So, Stella, are you happy with that as it's recorded? Great. Okay. So, all those in favor? All those not voting? And all those against. So that's passed unanimously. So I think that then brings us to the end of that item. So just like to say thanks very much, Paul, for all your help with that and for the report. It was very thorough. So that brings us to performance monitoring. Now I know Adrian Ash isn't with us today, but I know that John Bosley is. And so I just wanted to welcome maybe John to maybe make just comments, maybe a couple of the performance indicators that they're in there, and then invite any other questions from anyone in the panel. So John, if I can pass it to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. A few that I'd like to note. First one being CRP 103, which is the fly tip removal. In terms of our progress, there is a more positive movement in that direction. Just to give assurance to the panel that this is one that we actively review. We want to ensure that there's integrity in the reporting. As an example, last week we had 319 incidents. The average time of removal was 11.2 hours. So we have a lot of specifics in respect to this. But we want to ensure that we are improving on that indicator. The second one is the CRP 123. Let me track down to that for one moment. Which is, according to my writing, is this percentage of sites surveyed on our local street inspections with litter meeting the standard. Whilst it's yellow within the RAG status, this has been positively been moving forward. We have regular client team inspections and have seen a sustained improvement in this area. This is one that is key critical importance within the service area. Then moving into sporting, we have our water sports center, tracking the water sports center's income. Whilst not up to target level, it has shown a strong recovery over since the COVID period, but also over a difficult summer. And I would like to, give recognition to the staff over a very hot summer, dealing with blue-green algae blooms on the lake and others which have curtailed some of its use. We have maintained an active level and children have enjoyed that facility. And then lastly, SP 349 and 405, which is the use of our leisure centers where we have exceeded our targets again, especially between the 14 and 25 year old group. And it's good to see that we have young adults being very active, and overall a lot of people using these facilities and remaining active and healthy. Thank you, Chair.
Great, thank you very much. Are there any questions at all for John or any of the stats that are in there? Oh, Caroline.
Yes, thank you, John. I wanted to ask you about, you're saying about the fly tips and the litter, and it's really improved, which is great. You know, we all welcome that. But there are certain, certainly in my ward, there are certain particular hotspots where it is always litter on it, no matter how many times it gets cleared. Every time we go past, litter. Same with the fly tips. Certain fly tip hotspots, no matter how often it's cleared, it's back to square one the next day. So what actions could be taken about that?
Thank you very much, Chair. I agree. This is a conundrum that I have been trying to resolve for best part of 25 years of my working life, and haven't found a silver bullet yet. Persistence. Sometimes we have localized issues where we can design out those through either the addition of a bin or removal of a bin. Sometimes is an opportunity, but education of our community, education of our youth is what we need to strive for longer term, because litter and fly tipping aren't created by the council, they're created by the people in our community, and we need to be persistent about that. On a case-by-case basis, I'd be happy to work within my team to provide that support, though, to tackle that, because they're often really intrinsic issues locally that we need to address to hopefully tackle those points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And if there's no further questions, then I would just move on to actually, well, I should say thanks so much, John, for all those stats provided in the report. They are really thorough, and it's very helpful to have that. But yeah, on to the work program. Is that all agreed for the next meeting? Is everyone happy with that? Yeah, fantastic. And just a quick final point from me. At the last meeting, we agreed to set up a task force on EVs, just so you know that is something that Rosie is currently working on, and those that expressed an interest in that will be contacted soon on what's the next steps about that. And then finally, it's just to say, yeah, thank you all very much for attending. The next meeting will be on the 3rd November. We'll be considering Clarion housing and the first round of the budget. So yeah, thank you very much. And just so you know, we might also be looking at organising a potential site visit in between then. And actually, maybe just before it's finished, is there interest in doing such a site visit ahead of that meeting? I want to take the one very big thumbs up from Jill as a resounding yes from everyone. So
You are
thanks.
almost most welcome to all our Clarions in my ward. They are a perfect example of what we're trying to improve on.
I think my ward.
Yes, and in my ward as well, and where I live as well, even.
Okay, we might have to block out a week for these then. But anyway, yeah, huge thanks for your